Picture a man sitting in a makeup chair at 4 a.m., covered in green yak hair, a prosthetic nose he can barely breathe through, and contact lenses that feel like broken glass pressed against his eyeballs. And he's been told that a former Navy SEAL is on call specifically to help him mentally survive this every single morning for 92 days. That man is Jim Carrey. That movie is How the Grinch Stole Christmas. And that insane production reality, it's the perfect entry point into understanding why this film hits different. Because here's the thing, there's a reason The Grinch became the highest-grossing film of 2000 in the United States. Not Gladiator, not Castaway, not Mission, Impossible 2. A Christmas movie about a grumpy green cave dweller who hates holiday music. That movie? And there's something genuinely fascinating about why that happened. Why audiences showed up in such enormous numbers, why it's still playing in living rooms every December a quarter century later, and why it's a film that rewards way more analysis than most people give it credit for. Let's talk about it properly. Ron Howard, the man behind Apollo 13, A Beautiful Mind. Frost Nixon chose to make a Dr. Seuss adaptation as his holiday project, and he didn't play it safe, not even a little. He took a 26-page children's book that had already been adapted into a beloved 1966 animated special narrated by Boris Karloff, and he decided to go bigger, weirder, darker, and funnier all at once. He built entire worlds from scratch. He found an actor whose entire career had been building to this exact role. And he made choices, particularly about who the real villains of the story are, that completely reframe what The Grinch is actually about. But we'll get there. First, you need to understand what kind of movie this actually is, because calling it a Christmas comedy is accurate, the same way calling The Truman Show a TV show is accurate. Technically true, profoundly incomplete. Whoville. Let's start there. The first time we see Whoville, it's simultaneously the most charming and most unsettling place you've ever laid eyes on. Every building curves. Every chimney bends at an angle that shouldn't structurally support itself. The color palette looks like someone fed a bag of Christmas candy into a kaleidoscope and hit maximum saturation. The residents walk around in oversized clothing, with hair that defies gravity, wearing expressions of such uncomplicated seasonal enthusiasm that it borders on unnerving ... And the thing is, none of that was CGI. Whoville was built. Production designer Michael Kornblith and his team constructed a massive physical set that had to feel like a real community while simultaneously looking like something Dr. Seuss drew in a fever dream. Curved walls, hand-painted textures, lighting designed to give everything that slightly too bright, slightly too cheerful quality that the story needs. It's one of the last times Hollywood committed to this kind of full-scale practical world building for a family film, and it shows. There's a tactile weight to Whoville. You feel like you could reach into the screen and pick up one of those bizarrely shaped ornaments. Now, December in Whoville isn't just Christmas, it's Christmas time. Capital C, all-consuming, total life. Takeover, Christmas time. The Whos don't observe Christmas, they perform it, competitively, loudly, with enormous social stakes attached. Mayor Augustus Mayhew, played by Jeffrey Tambor with the specific energy of a man who has never once doubted that he deserves to be the most important person in any room, is gearing up for Whoville's annual Whobilation ceremony, which is essentially a Christmas pageant crossed with a political rally crossed with a Black Friday sale. Everyone is shopping, decorating, comparing, one-upping. There are gift-buying contests. There are light displays that are clearly just thinly veiled status symbols. There is the palpable social pressure of an entire community that has collectively decided that more is more, and even more is better. Into this world walks, or rather stumbles, Cindy Lou, who, played by a very young Taylor Momsen, yes, that Taylor Momsen, years before she'd become the lead singer of the Pretty Reckless. Cindy Lou is 6 years old and she has a problem that none of the other Whos seem to share. She's paying attention. She notices things. She notices that her dad works himself to exhaustion and her family barely sees him during what's supposed to be the most wonderful time of the year. She notices that the Jubilee celebration is more about spectacle than spirit. And she notices, more than anyone else in Whoville, more than the adults who've long since stopped asking questions, that there's a creature living up on my tea. Crumpet, who used to be part of this community and isn't anymore, and nobody seems to think that's worth addressing. Cindy Lou is the moral conscience of this film. She doesn't know it yet, but she's asking the right question at the worst possible time in the worst possible place, and the entire story turns on whether anyone around her is willing to listen. And then there's the Grinch, Mantieste. Crumpet looms over Whoville like a warning that everyone ignores. It's cold and dark and covered in accumulated garbage, because for decades the Whos have been shooting their trash up there via a pneumatic waste system, and the Grinch has been living in it. That's not a metaphor. That's the actual setup. The community has literally built their way of life by dumping their refuse on their most marginalized resident, and then they act baffled that he hates them. But we'll come back to that. The Grinch's lair is magnificent. It's a cave carved into the mountain, stuffed with everything he's ever stolen from Whoville. Mismatched furniture, broken gadgets, stacks of things that were clearly discarded and reclaimed. There's a chaotic, almost artistic quality to his hoarding. It looks like the inside of someone's head when they've spent 40 years turning resentment into decoration. His dog, Max, is his only companion, a small, long-suffering animal who somehow manages to be the most relatable character in a movie full of characters who are each relatable in their own specific way. And then there's the Grinch himself. Jim Carrey appears on screen and, look, there's really no way to describe it except to say that he becomes something, not an actor in makeup. Not Jim Carrey doing a funny voice. Something genuinely other. He moves differently. His posture is wrong in a way that's somehow completely right for the character. He contorts and lurches and glares and mutters and then, without warning, lands a one-liner with the timing of a man who has spent his entire career perfecting exactly this kind of comedic precision. The Grinch, in Carrey's hands, is many things at once. He's absurd and genuinely funny. He's pathetic in the specific way that someone is pathetic when they've been hurt and never healed. And this is the part that matters. He's right about almost everything he says about Whoville. His cynicism isn't baseless. His disgust isn't irrational. He sees through the consumerist performance of Christmas with a clarity that the Whos themselves don't have. And if he weren't also catastrophically emotionally damaged, you'd probably agree with him more often than not. That tension, the Grinch as both punchline and prophet, both villain and victim, is what makes this film so much more interesting than its reputation suggests. It's why adults who love this movie as kids find that it hits differently when they watch it in their 20s, 30s, older. The comedy is still there, but the darkness underneath it gets a little more visible with every year of lived experience you bring to the screen. The year 2000 matters here. The Grinch hit theaters on November 17, 2000, right at the leading edge of what would become a two-decade wave of classic IP adapted for live-action family blockbuster. It was, in many ways, the prototype. Take a beloved property, attach a massive star, build an enormous production, lean into spectacle while trusting that nostalgia will fill the seats. The formula was not yet cliché in 2000. It was new, it worked. How well it worked is almost comical in retrospect. The film grossed $55 million in its opening weekend alone, held the record at the time for the highest-grossing second weekend of any film ever released, and became the top-grossing domestic film of the year. But the critical response was divided, and that divide is interesting. Some critics saw a miracle of casting and production design in service of a story that had real emotional truth. Others saw Jim Carrey overwhelming the film with sheer personality, a machine generating physical comedy at the expense of genuine feeling. Both things are partially right. Both perspectives miss something the other one catches. The film is messy. It's also brilliant. It's overlong in some places and not long enough in others. It's one of the best performances of Jim Carrey's career, and sometimes Jim Carrey is doing a lot. Ron Howard directs with extraordinary technical confidence and occasionally questionable tonal judgment. These aren't criticisms that cancel each other out. They coexist, which is exactly what makes The Grinch worth taking seriously as an object of analysis. Because the things this movie does well, it does extraordinarily well. And those things, the performance, the production design, the thematic inversions, the specific kind of outsider psychology the film explores, deserve more than it's a fun Christmas classic shrug and a move on. So, let's not move on. Picture a man sitting in a makeup chair at 4 in the morning, green yak hair glued to every surface of his face, a prosthetic nose he can barely breathe through, contact lenses that feel like sandpaper pressed directly against his eyeballs. And somewhere nearby, a former Navy SEAL is on standby, hired specifically, deliberately, professionally, to teach this man psychological endurance techniques used by soldiers in captivity. That man is Jim Carrey. That's not a rumor or a behind-the-scenes myth. That's just Tuesday on the set of How the Grinch Stole Christmas, and the fact that a major Hollywood Christmas comedy required a military torture resistance consultant to keep its star functional tells you almost everything you need to know about what kind of movie this actually is. Because The Grinch has always been filed under holiday classic, a comfortable rewatch, every December, hot chocolate and blanket kind of movie. And it is that. But it's also something stranger and sharper and more psychologically loaded than that label gives it credit for. This is a film about consumerism eating itself, about what a community does to the people it rejects and then pretends the rejection never happened, about a man, Well, a creature who isn't wrong about almost anything he believes, but is completely wrong about what to do about it. And it just so happens to be one of the most physically committed performances in the history of Hollywood blockbusters, wrapped inside one of the most impressive practical productions of the early 2000s. So yeah, let's talk about it properly. The man who said yes. Ron Howard didn't stumble into this project. He chose it. The same Ron Howard who directed Apollo 13 and Backdraft, who was 2 years away from winning the Academy Award for Best Director for A Beautiful Mind. He looked at the landscape of available projects and decided to spend the better part of 2 years adapting a 26-page children's book into a live-action spectacle. That's a choice that says something, and what it says is that Howard saw something in this material that wasn't obvious from the outside. What he saw, in part, was Jim Carrey. By the year 2000, Carrey had already given us Ace Ventura, The Mask, Dumb and Dumber, The Truman Show, Man on the Moon. He was, by any reasonable measure, the most physically inventive mainstream comedian on the planet. His body was an instrument. His face was a special effect in its own right. And the Grinch, the sneering, lurching, chaotic, deeply wounded anti-hero of Dr. Seuss's 1957 book, was a character that seemed to exist in a dimension that only Jim Carrey's particular brand of controlled chaos could inhabit. The gamble paid off. How the Grinch Stole Christmas opened on November 17, 2000, and it became the highest-grossing domestic film of the entire year. Not Gladiator, not Castaway, not Mission Impossible 2, a Christmas movie about a green cave hermit who hates holiday music. It made $260 million domestically and over $345 million worldwide, and it held records for holiday opening weekends for years afterward. But box office numbers don't tell you why people kept coming back. They don't explain why this movie has the specific staying power it does, why it gets pulled out every December, why people who were kids in 2000 now watch it with their own kids, why it generates more genuine affection than many technically superior films from the same era. For that, you have to actually look at the thing. Whoville is wrong. The first time you see Whoville, your brain does something interesting. It processes charming and unsettling simultaneously, and doesn't quite know how to reconcile them. Every building in Whoville curves. Every chimney bends at angles that shouldn't structurally hold. The streets spiral in directions that suggest whoever designed this town had never encountered a right angle and didn't miss them. The residents wear clothing that belongs to no identifiable decade or fashion movement, giant collars, absurd hats, hair that achieves shapes not found in nature. And their faces carry that specific expression of people who are absolutely, unquestionably, not open to debate. Happy, which, when you're watching it on screen, is maybe 15% charming and 85% deeply alarming. Here's what makes that remarkable. None of it was computer-generated. Whoville was built. Production designer Michael Kornblith and a crew of hundreds constructed an enormous physical set. Curved buildings, hand-painted textures, practical lighting designed to make every surface glow with that slightly too bright, slightly too perfect quality that the story needs. This was old-school Hollywood world building at a scale that barely exists anymore. You could walk through Whoville. You could touch the walls. The fakeness of it was entirely intentional because the story needs a world that feels performative from the ground up, a place where everything is aggressively, exhaustingly on. And that quality, aggressively, exhaustingly on, describes Whoville's relationship with Christmas perfectly. In Whoville, December isn't the season, it's a full-contact sport. The Whos don't celebrate Christmas so much as they compete at it. Mayor Augustus Mayhew, Jeffrey Tambor, doing what Jeffrey Tambor does best, which is playing the specific kind of man who has absolutely no self-awareness about how insufferable he is preparing for the annual jubilation ceremony with the energy of a political candidate 3 days before an election he's terrified of losing. There are gift-buying competitions, decorating rivalries, the kind of performative seasonal enthusiasm where the actual spirit of the thing has been completely hollowed out and replaced with status anxiety dressed up in tinsel. Watch the background of any Whoville scene carefully. The Whos aren't enjoying Christmas, they're executing it. There's a difference. And the film knows there's a difference, even if most characters in it don't. The girl who's paying attention into this world comes Cindy Lou Who. She's 6 years old, played by Taylor Momsen. Yes, the same Taylor Momsen who would later become the leather and eyeliner lead singer of The Pretty Reckless. But in 2000, she's a small girl with wide eyes and a quiet, searching quality that the film needs desperately and uses brilliantly. Cindy Lou is the only Who in Whoville who seems to notice that something is off. She notices her father working himself into the ground during a season that's supposed to be about family. She notices that the Jubilee is more about winning than celebrating. She notices, and this is the part that sets the whole story in motion, that there's a creature living alone on the mountain outside of town, and that his isolation isn't mysterious or accidental, and that nobody seems to think it's worth addressing. Cindy Lou is 6 years old, and she has arrived at a moral conclusion that the entire adult population of Whoville has avoided for decades. The Grinch is alone because they made him that way. And she's going to do something about it, even though she's 6 and doesn't fully understand what she's walking into. That's not a small thing. In a movie that's often celebrated for its comedy and its spectacle, the emotional engine is a child's instinct for fairness running up against a community that has decided its own comfort is more important than its own conscience. Cindy Lou isn't naive. She's perceptive, and the film treats her perceptiveness with a genuine respect that elevates every scene she's in. The mountain and what lives there. Mount Crumpet rises above Whoville like a bad thought you can't shake. It's perpetually cold up there, perpetually gray. And at the top, in a cave carved into the rock, the Grinch has lived alone for decades, surrounded by everything he's stolen from Whoville over the years, and by the accumulated trash that the Whos have been pneumatically launching up the mountain for as long as anyone can remember. That last detail isn't throwaway. Whoville literally uses the Grinch's home as a garbage dump. The community has spent decades making the mountain uninhabitable as a side effect of their own convenience, and the creature living in that garbage, the creature they created through cruelty and exclusion, is the monster they've collectively decided to be afraid of. The Grinch didn't choose to be the outcast of Whoville. He was assigned that role, and the Whos have been decorating around him ever since. His lair, though. His lair is something else. It's cluttered and chaotic in a way that feels specific rather than random. Everything salvaged, everything repurposed, stacks of objects that tell the story of a mind that refused to stop being curious even when it had every reason to shut down entirely. His cave looks like the inside of a personality that's been retrofitted for survival, and Max, his dog, long-suffering and inexplicably loyal, wanders through it all with the expression of an animal that has made peace with his situation and would like, just once, to sleep on something soft. Then the Grinch himself steps into frame. And here's where the movie stops being just a movie. What Jim Carrey did. 92 days in full prosthetic makeup, 2.5 hours of application every single morning before cameras could roll. The process was so physically and psychologically grueling that Carrey, who had more screen experience than almost anyone on the planet at that point, described it as one of the most difficult things he'd ever done. He asked for help. They brought in a man who trained military personnel to survive interrogation. They worked through techniques for mental endurance and psychological compartmentalization, and Carrey went back to that makeup chair the next morning. That's what's on screen when you watch the Grinch move. It's not Jim Carrey doing a character. It's not an actor hitting marks and saying lines. It's someone who spent 3 months becoming a specific kind of creature, understanding its physicality from the inside, learning how to make prosthetics communicate through pure body language when the usual tools of facial expression are buried under an inch of latex. The Grinch leans wrong. He stands wrong. He moves through space with the particular gait of something that has spent decades alone and has therefore never had to perform normalcy for an audience. And then he opens his mouth. The comedy is extraordinary. The timing is extraordinary. There's a scene, the Grinch reading through his daily schedule, that Carrey largely improvised, and it's funnier than most comedies manage in their entire runtime. But what's really extraordinary is that underneath all the physical invention and the comedic pyrotechnics, there's a genuine emotional truth running through every single scene. The Grinch is hilarious. The Grinch is also a portrait of a specific kind of psychological damage, and Carrey doesn't let you forget either thing. What kind of movie this actually is. How the Grinch Stole Christmas arrived in the year 2000, right at the beginning of what would become a long Hollywood trend. Classic IP, live-action treatment, enormous star, maximum spectacle. It was in many ways the template. But it did something that its successors mostly didn't bother to do. It took the source material seriously enough to push against it, to ask questions the original story didn't ask, to find the darkness inside the warmth and illuminate both at the same time. Is it a perfect film? No. It's uneven in places, too long in others, and occasionally undone by its own ambition. But it's a film that's trying to do real things, things worth examining closely, things that hold up under scrutiny and, in some cases, get more interesting with each passing year. The Grinch didn't steal Christmas because he was simply bad. The Whos didn't lose Christmas because they were simply good. The story is more tangled than that, and more honest, and ultimately more generous. To the monster, to the community, and to everyone watching who's ever felt like they were standing outside something they weren't allowed to be part of. That's what we're here to talk about. Every layer of it. Let's start at the beginning. Every good story starts with a world out of balance. Not obviously, catastrophically out of balance. Not yet. just slightly wrong, tilted at an angle that most people have stopped noticing because they've lived inside it long enough. The Grinch opens in exactly that space, a community that looks perfectly festive on the surface and is, underneath, quietly rotting from the inside out. Whoville is 6 days from Christmas, and Whoville is losing its mind. The Jubilee Machine. The annual jubilation is coming, and with it comes the full weight of Whoville's social hierarchy. This isn't just a Christmas party. It's the event that determines who matters, who shines, who gets to stand next to Mayor Mayho in the center of things and bask in the seasonal glow of public approval. Everyone in town is preparing, but preparing is a generous word. What they're actually doing is competing. The stores are packed. The gift lists are long. Lorelei, who, played with gleeful shallowness by Christine Baranski, is the living embodiment of Whoville's consumerist engine. She doesn't want the best Christmas. She wants a better Christmas than everyone else's. She wants more lights, more gifts, more spectacle. She's not a villain in the traditional sense. She doesn't have a plan or an agenda, but she represents something the film is quietly, consistently critical of, the person who's turned a celebration of connection into a personal performance review. And Mayor Augustus Mayho feeds all of it. He runs Whoville's holiday season the way a campaign manager runs an election, with maximum visibility, minimum substance, and absolutely zero tolerance for anything that might complicate the message. He announces the jubilation, he crowns the cheermeister, he controls the narrative. He is, in the specific language of the movie, the reason the Whos can't see themselves clearly. Because as long as he's telling the story, they're always the heroes of it. Watch how the Whos interact with each other in the background of these early scenes. There's a competitive undercurrent to almost every exchange. Who decorated first? Who spent more? Who has the better costume? They're not mean to each other exactly, but they're not warm either. They're performing warmth, which is something completely different, and the film knows the difference even when the characters don't. A 6-year-old asks a question. Nobody wants to answer Cindy Lou, who is in the middle of all of this, and she doesn't like what she sees. The specific trigger for her unease isn't philosophical, it's personal. She watches her father, Lou, who exhausts himself decorating and shopping and participating in every layer of the holiday machine, and she notices that he's not happy. He's busy. He's functional. He hits every required mark of Whoville Christmas-time participation. But somewhere underneath all that tinsel and effort, there's a man who's lost the thread of why any of it is supposed to matter. So Cindy Lou starts asking questions, not confrontational, not accusatory. She's 6, and she's asking in the way a 6-year-old asks things, which is with a directness that adults have mostly trained themselves out of. She wants to know why the Grinch lives on the mountain. She wants to know what happened. She wants to know why, in a season that's supposed to be about everyone, there's someone that everyone has quietly agreed not to think about. The adults around her don't have good answers. Some of them deflect. Some give her the party line. The Grinch is mean. The Grinch hates Christmas. End of discussion. The mayor's response, when she eventually approaches him, is essentially a masterclass in institutional dismissal. Acknowledge the question, reframe it, redirect to the official narrative, move on. He has no interest in the Grinch as a person. He has an interest in the Grinch as a story that keeps Whoville unified in collective disapproval. But Cindy Lou has already decided what she wants to do. She's going to nominate the Grinch as the Jubilation's holiday cheermeister. She's going to bring him down from the mountain. She's going to fix this. It's a plan that only a child could concoct because it requires the kind of absolute, uncomplicated faith that adults spent most of their lives arguing themselves out of. It also, and the film earns this, turns out to be the right plan. Not immediately, not cleanly, but at its core, the idea that you fix an old wound by refusing to keep pretending it isn't there, that's not naive, that's just correct. The backstory the book never told. Here's where Ron Howard's adaptation does something genuinely bold, something that changes the entire moral landscape of the story. The original 1957 Seuss book doesn't give the Grinch an origin. He's simply mean. He always was. His heart is 2 sizes too small, and that's the fact of him, and the Whos' goodness will eventually reach even him. It's a clean moral equation, and it works beautifully as a children's book precisely because it doesn't complicate the Grinch's condition with cause and effect. The 2000 film blows that up. Through a sequence of flashbacks, rendered with a softer visual palette, a more muted color scheme that makes Whoville look like it was gentler once, or maybe just seems that way through the distorting lens of memory, we learn who the Grinch was before he became the Grinch. He was a child. A weird child, certainly, green-skinned, with hands that weren't quite right, and a face that made the other who children stare. He was brought to Whoville as an infant, found on a doorstep, raised by 2 aunts who loved him completely. He had friends. He had a best friend, actually, a girl named Martha May Whoville, who saw past every strange and unsettling thing about him and just liked him. He liked her back, in the specific, wordless, overwhelming way that children feel things before they have the vocabulary to name them. He made her a present, a handmade, imperfect, genuine present, the kind that only exists when someone cares more about meaning than execution. He shaved his face for the first time to impress her, and it went badly, because he was young and he didn't know what he was doing, and the result made him look stranger than before. The other kids laughed. The class laughed. Martha May didn't, but the damage was done. The Grinch, humiliated in the moment he was most vulnerable, grabbed a pair of scissors and did something rash and ran away and kept running until he found the mountain, and he never really came back down. That's the wound. That's the whole wound. A child who was different was made to feel that being different was a crime, and he took the lesson to heart so completely that it reshaped everything that came after. The Grinch doesn't hate Christmas. He hates what Christmas did to him when he was small enough that it could still do things to him. He hates the memory of wanting to belong and being told, without words, that belonging wasn't for creatures like him. This backstory is the most important addition the film makes to the source material, and it's the one that makes the rest of the movie's moral complexity possible. Because once you know this, once you see young Grinch standing in that classroom with his badly shaved face, reaching for the one moment of genuine connection he'd allowed himself, the adult Grinch's misanthropy stops being a character defect and starts being a survival strategy. He didn't become mean, he became defended. Meanwhile, on the mountain, the Grinch's daily life, what exists of it, runs on resentment and routine. He wakes up, he catalogs his grievances against the Whos, he takes pleasure in small acts of petty vandalism, stealing their mail, spooking their reindeer, and he retreats back into his lair to fume. Max watches all of this with the patient resignation of someone who has signed an unbreakable contract and is serving out his term with dignity. What the film is smart enough to show, though, is that underneath the resentment, the Grinch is desperately bored. He's not content up there. He's not at peace. He's maintaining his misery the way some people maintain a grudge, actively, deliberately, with enormous energy, because the alternative, letting go, coming back down, risking it again, is more terrifying than any amount of festering isolation. There's a scene early in the film where he's going through his daily planner. It's mostly improvised by Carrie, and it's one of the funniest sequences in the movie. A list of non-activities dressed up as a packed schedule, the comedy of a man performing busyness to avoid acknowledging that he has nothing. 6003, wallow in self-pity. 7000, stare into the abyss. 7030, solve world hunger. Tell no one. It's funny because it's absurd. It's resonant because it's honest. The Grinch isn't a hermit who's found peace in solitude. He's a deeply social creature who has convinced himself that he doesn't need what he clearly, visibly needs. That contradiction, the creature who preaches isolation while craving connection, is the engine that Cindy Lou's invitation is about to knock loose. The invitation and what it costs. Cindy Lou's plan has a problem, and the problem is Mayor Mayhew. He doesn't want the Grinch at the Whobilation. Not because he's afraid of what the Grinch might do, although that's the official story, but because the Grinch's presence would complicate the narrative Mayhew has been maintaining for years. The Grinch is Whoville's collective guilt given physical form. He lives on the mountain above them as a living reminder of the things they did and the cruelty they participated in and the child they ran off. As long as he stays up there, they don't have to look at any of that. The moment he comes down, the story gets harder to tell cleanly. But Cindy Lou pushes and she wins, and the invitation goes out. The Grinch receives it on the mountain. And what happens next? The internal battle between his defensive cynicism and his buried, armored, almost extinguished desire to be part of something is played by Carrie with a precision that the whole scene depends on. He reads the invitation. He puts it down. He picks it up again. There's a moment where his expression shifts. Not to joy, not to excitement, just to something unguarded, something that hasn't had air in a long time, and then the armor snaps back into place and he starts being sarcastic again. But he goes. He actually goes. And that decision, made despite everything, made against 40 years of accumulated reasons not to, is the first crack in the wall. Small enough to miss if you're not watching for it, large enough that nothing that follows is possible without it. What Act 1 has built. By the time the Grinch makes his way down from Mount Crumpet toward Whoville, the film has accomplished something that a lot of Christmas movies never bother with. It has made all of its pieces matter. Whoville isn't just a colorful backdrop, it's a community with a specific pathology. The Whos aren't just supporting characters, they're the co-authors of the problem they're about to face. Cindy Lou isn't just the moral center, she's the active force driving the story forward through genuine conviction. And the Grinch isn't just a villain warming up for his redemption arc. He's a fully formed, recognizably human sort of being, carrying real damage, walking toward a situation that has every chance of going catastrophically wrong. That's a solid Act 1. That's a lot of structural and emotional weight laid down before the real fireworks start. And the fireworks, when they start, are going to be spectacular. The Grinch comes down from the mountain in a Santa suit. Let that image sit for a second. The creature who has spent 40-plus years treating Whoville like a personal enemy territory, who has stolen their mail, sabotaged their carolers, and spent every December seething in a cave above their rooftops, descends into the heart of the community he hates wearing their most sacred seasonal costume. And the wild thing is, it's not entirely a disguise. Some part of him, the part he can't quite kill no matter how hard he tries, genuinely wants this to work. That tension between the Grinch's armored exterior and the raw, terrified thing still alive underneath it is what Act 2 is built around. And Act 2 does not go well. The Grinch in the room. He arrives at the Whobilation and immediately overwhelms it. There's no other word for it. He's louder, stranger, more physically present than anything else in the room, and the Whos don't know how to process him. Some are delighted. The novelty of his presence, the spectacle of him, is exciting in the way that any dangerous thing is exciting when you're fairly sure you're safe. Some are genuinely happy to see him, and some, particularly the mayor, are doing a very careful calculation about how to use this situation to maximum advantage. Carrie plays the Whobilation sequence as a series of micro-negotiations. The Grinch keeps lowering his guard by about 2%, testing the temperature, checking whether it's safe. Then something sets him off. A stare, a murmur, someone reacting to his hands or his face the way people have always reacted, and the armor slams back up and he covers the vulnerability with performance. He starts doing bits. He starts being the Grinch, in quotes, the character, the spectacle, because being that is so much easier than being the actual, undefended thing underneath. Watch his eyes during these scenes. Even underneath all the prosthetics, Carrie is doing something extraordinary. There's a moment, brief, easy to miss, where he's standing near Cindy Lou, and she says something kind to him, something without agenda, and for about half a second, his whole face changes. The performance drops. The creature looks out. And then it's gone. And the Grinch is back, being loud and strange and untouchable. Half a second of unguarded honesty in a 2-hour movie, and it's the most emotionally precise moment in the whole sequence. Martha May Whovier and the Mayor's Gambit. Then Mayor Mayhew makes his move. Martha May Whovier is there. She grew up, she stayed in Whoville, she became beautiful in the conventional Who sense, and she's been navigating the complicated business of having once been the closest thing the Grinch had to a friend. Christine Baranski plays her with a specific kind of carefully maintained composure that suggests a woman who has thought about the Grinch more than she admits and would very much like this evening to go smoothly. It's not going to go smoothly. The mayor, who has also been in love with Martha May for most of his adult life, identifies the Grinch's one exposed nerve with the precision of someone who's had years to study the map of another person's insecurities. He proposes to Martha May, right there, in front of everyone, at the Whobilation, in the most public possible way, and he does it while making eye contact with the Grinch. Because this isn't just a proposal, it's a performance. It's a message. It's a mayor using a woman as a weapon to remind the town's designated monster exactly where he stands in the hierarchy. And it works. Horribly. Precisely. Completely. It works. The classroom humiliation. The moment that sent young Grinch to the mountain in the first place is being replicated in real time, in front of an audience, by a man who understands exactly what he's doing. The Grinch's reaction is immediate and total. The last shred of openness he'd carried down from the mountain burns away. The effort he'd made, the Santa suit, the attempt, the half-second of genuine vulnerability, curdles into something uglier and harder. And the Grinch, standing in the middle of the Whobilation, makes a decision. If they want a monster, they'll get one. What follows is one of Jim Carrey's finest sequences on screen, and it's fine in a way that's almost uncomfortable to watch. The Grinch goes full theatrical villain. He destroys the event. He mocks the mayor. He does everything that confirms every bad thing Whoville has ever said about him, but Carrey never loses the thread of genuine pain running underneath the performance. He's not enjoying this. He's using this. He's taking his own wound and turning it outward at maximum velocity because it's the only thing he knows how to do with it. The laughter in the theater during this sequence is real, but it's layered over something that isn't funny at all, and the best version of watching this movie is the version where you feel both things at once. He leaves, takes whatever dignity he can carry, goes back up the mountain, and somewhere during the walk back up, the Grinch gets an idea. The plan. I'm a mean one, Mr. Grinch. The Grinch's plan to steal Christmas is not, if you think about it, remotely logical. He cannot literally steal Christmas. He knows this. On some level, the plan is less about the Who's tree and their presents and their roast beast, and more about, what? Revenge, obviously, but also something that looks, from a certain angle, less like rage and more like grief. If he takes Christmas away, the Who's will finally know what it feels like to want something they can't have. They'll finally understand what it means to reach for belonging and find nothing there. It's the plan of someone who has never been given a better option. Back on Mattine. Crumpet. The transformation is almost immediate. The Grinch who came down the mountain, careful, testing, almost hopeful, is gone. What's left is pure forward momentum, pure terrible purpose, and an absolutely magnificent villain's energy that the movie rides for everything it's worth. He designs a sleigh. He schemes. He monologues to Max, who listens with the patient tolerance of a very good dog who has seen this before and knows it will end exactly how it always ends. And he sows. There's something both funny and oddly poignant about the Grinch constructing his Christmas thieving outfit by hand, the Satisuit engineered for maximum menace, every detail considered, the whole project executed with the specific focus of someone who is, when properly motivated, extraordinarily competent. The Grinch is good at things. He's smart, creative, mechanically gifted, and possessed of an organizational clarity that puts most of Whoville to shame. The tragedy of his situation isn't that he lacks capability. It's that all of his capability has been redirected for decades into the business of protecting himself from other people. The plan sequence is played for comedy, and the comedy works beautifully. Carrie at his most inventively physical, but the underlying engine is genuinely dark. This is a man burning down something he secretly loves because he can't figure out how to belong to it, and the film knows that. It doesn't hide it. The night before, the setup for the actual theft is careful and deliberate, and the film is smart enough to make the logistical preparation part of the spectacle. The Grinch scouts Whoville. He knows its rhythms. Of course he does. He's been watching from above for 40 years. He knows when everyone will be asleep. He knows the layout of the town. He knows exactly which houses have what and in what order he'll need to move. Max gets antlers. The sled gets loaded. And the Grinch, standing on the edge of his mountain looking down at Whoville glittering in the December dark, delivers a line that the movie earns completely because of everything that preceded it. "You're a mean one, Mr. Grinch," except he says it to himself. Not with self-pity, with something more complicated, something that sounds almost like acceptance, as if he's looked at every version of himself that was ever possible and concluded, correctly or not, that this is the one that survived, that the mean one is the only one that made it through. It's a genuinely affecting beat in the middle of what is, technically, the villain's pre-heist brag. That's the movie in miniature, something funny and something heartbreaking, sitting right next to each other, refusing to move aside for the other. What makes Act 2 work? Act 2 is structurally obligated to be the place where things get worse before they get better, and worse is a hard sell when you're making a family holiday film. The 2000 Grinch navigates this by doing something surprisingly sophisticated. It keeps both sympathies alive simultaneously. You feel the Who's shock when the Grinch disrupts the Whobilation. You also feel the Grinch's justification for it. You root against the plan. You don't want Christmas stolen. You don't want the Who's to suffer. And you simultaneously understand, maybe more than is entirely comfortable, why the creature making the plan arrived at this destination. The Whobilation sequence doesn't give you a clear villain. Mayor Mayhew comes closest, but even he's pathetic more than truly malicious. What it gives you instead is a situation, a collection of people with incompatible needs and no shared language for addressing them, and it lets that situation produce its own disaster. That's not how most holiday movies work. Most holiday movies have a clear bad guy and a clear good guy and a clear path from one to the other. The Grinch has a bad situation and a lot of people who are, in their own ways, responding to it badly. The resolution isn't going to be about defeating someone. It's going to be about understanding something. And before understanding can happen, things have to get considerably worse. The sleigh loads up on Christmas Eve, the Grinch begins. The sequence that follows, the systematic, professional, almost elegant dismantling of Whoville's Christmas, is constructed with a comedic precision that's genuinely impressive. It's a heist movie, essentially. If the target were holiday cheer and the heist team were one green creature and one very cooperative dog in reindeer antler. Every house gets stripped, trees come down, presents disappear, stockings vanish from mantelpieces. The Grinch moves through sleeping Whoville like a shadow that hums to itself, occasionally muttering commentary, occasionally getting sidetracked by something interesting, and then he walks into the house of Cindy Lou Who. She's awake. She's standing in her kitchen, small and solemn, watching him. And the Grinch, who has spent the entire night executing a flawless plan, suddenly has to improvise. He tells her he's fixing the tree. He gives her a glass of water. He puts her back to bed. He tucks her in. He tucks her in. That moment, reflexive, unplanned, completely at odds with every single thing he's been doing for the past hour, tells you more about the Grinch than almost any other scene in the film. He's not incapable of tenderness. He's not incapable of care. Underneath all the damage and the years of practiced misanthropy, there's something that still responds to a child's trust the way it's supposed to. He didn't plan to tuck Cindy Lou in. He just did it. Because some part of him, the part that made a present in a classroom long ago, the part that went down the mountain in a Santa suit, hasn't entirely given up. He finishes the job. Every last decoration, every gift, every trace of Christmas in Whoville loaded onto the sleigh and hauled up toward Mint Crumpet. And now, the real test begins. Mentine Crumpet. Crumpet at dawn on Christmas morning is one of the most visually striking images in the entire film. The sleigh is parked at the peak, piled impossibly high. Every tree, every wrapped box, every stocking, every strand of lights, a mountain of stolen meaning balanced at the edge of a cliff in the gray early morning dark. The Grinch stands beside it, arms spread, face lifted toward the valley below, waiting. He's waiting for the sound he came here to hear. The sound of Whoville waking up and finding nothing. The sound of a community discovering that everything it organized its identity around has been taken away overnight. He wants to hear it fall apart. He wants proof that Christmas was always the thing he thought it was, a surface, a performance, a collectively maintained illusion, and that without the decorations and the gifts and the spectacle, there's nothing underneath, no spirit, no actual love, just the hollow machinery of a holiday that the Whos dressed themselves in every year without understanding what they were wearing. He waits, and then he hears it, the sound. He wasn't prepared for singing. Not crying, not wailing, not the sound of a community in collapse, singing. Whoville wakes up on Christmas morning, finds every decoration gone, every present missing, every tree stripped bare, and they sing anyway. They hold hands in the town square and they sing, and the sound travels up the mountain and reaches the Grinch like something he has no category for. This is the scene the entire film has been building toward, and it works, genuinely, powerfully works. Because the movie has done the homework to earn it. You spent the previous 90 minutes watching Whoville be materialistic and performative and socially competitive, so the natural expectation is that stripping away all the stuff will reveal the emptiness underneath. That's what the Grinch expects. That's what his whole theory of Whoville is based on, and the film denies him that confirmation. Not by pretending the Whos were never shallow, but by insisting that shallowness isn't the whole story. Because here's the thing about the Whos that the film has also been showing you. In quieter moments, underneath all the tinsel, there's genuine warmth there too. Lou Who, exhausted and overlooked, who still finds time to be kind. Cindy Lou, whose entire arc has been about seeing the real thing underneath the performance. The aunts who raised the Grinch with actual love. The community that, when the trappings are stripped away, discovers that the reason they gathered together was not actually about the trappings. The Grinch's face in this moment is everything. Carrie goes completely still, which is, given what he's been doing physically for the entire film, genuinely startling. The chaos stops. The performance stops. And what's left is a creature standing at the edge of a cliff with a sleigh full of stolen Christmas and an expression of pure, helpless, devastating disorientation. Everything he believed was wrong. Not wrong in the sense of a simple mistake, not wrong in the way you're wrong about a fact that can be corrected. Wrong in the sense that the entire architecture of meaning he'd built his life around has just been gently, without drama, without confrontation, disproved by a community singing in a snow-covered square at sunrise. The Grinch's small heart grew 3 sizes that day. Anthony Hopkins' narration lands on that line with a precision that the whole film has been setting up, and it earns it completely. The phrase comes from the original Seuss text, but the 2000 film gives it a weight that the book never needed to carry, because in the book, the Grinch's smallness of heart is a given condition, and its growth is the resolution. In this film, you've watched that small heart defend itself for nearly 2 hours, watched it build walls and maintain distance and convert every impulse toward connection into a weapon against itself. Its growth isn't just a resolution, it's a hard-won reversal of decades of psychological self-protection. And that's a different thing entirely. The sleigh on the edge. The sequence that follows is the film at its most purely cinematic. The sleigh, impossibly overloaded, teetering at the peak, begins to slide. The Grinch grabs it, one creature against the combined weight of an entire town's Christmas, balanced over a cliff, and the Grinch holds on. His feet dig into the snow, his arms shake. Every physical thing about Jim Carrey's performance in this moment is communicating effort, strain, desperation, and underneath that, something new, the absolute refusal to let this slip away a second time. He was the cause of it. He took it. And now he's going to hold it together with his bare hands if that's what it takes. Because that's what you do when your heart grows 3 sizes and you suddenly have 3 times the capacity for understanding what actually matters. He holds the sleigh. He pulls it back from the edge. The physical comedy of the moment. One creature versus all. Physics, veins visible, snow flying, is undercut by something entirely genuine, and the combination is exactly what Ron Howard's direction has been calibrated to produce throughout. You laugh, and the laughter doesn't dissipate the emotion, it coexists with it. Max watches the whole thing with the expression of a dog who has been right about his owner's fundamental goodness all along and is choosing not to say anything about it. Coming home. The Grinch's return to Whoville is staged as an arrival, not a surrender. He doesn't slink back in with his stolen goods and his tail between his legs. He comes back in on the sleigh, everything loaded, in motion, with an energy that's completely different from the calculating stillness of his departure the night before. Whoville, to its credit, receives him. Cindy Lou runs to him. The Who's, some cautious, some confused, some genuinely moved, let him in. The moment is allowed to be quiet rather than triumphant, which is the right call. A big redemption fanfare would undercut what the film has been building. What this scene needs is not spectacle but honesty, the simple, almost tentative beginning of a different relationship between a creature and a community that has a long and complicated history and is deciding right now whether to try something new. And then Mayor Mayhew opens his mouth. Even here, even at the moment of Christmas morning reconciliation, Mayhew can't resist. He tries to reassert the old narrative, positions himself as the authority, redirects attention, attempts to use the crowd the way he always uses the crowd. It's a small moment, but it's crucial. It shows that the Who's redemption isn't total, that the community still contains the same people who created the original wound, and that healing isn't going to be as simple as one morning of singing. What changes the dynamic is Cindy Lou, 6 years old, standing in the middle of Whoville's most consequential social moment. She does what she's been doing throughout the entire film. She says the true thing out loud. Her Christmas wish, articulated with the direct, uncomplicated clarity that children deploy when they haven't yet learned to soften the truth for other people's comfort, isn't for presents or decorations or the restoration of the Jubilee. It's for her father to have more time. It's for Christmas to mean what it's supposed to mean rather than what Whoville has been using it to mean. It's a small speech. It's an enormous statement. And the Who's, to their credit, hear it this time, the roast beast. The film ends not with a ceremony or a parade or a grand gesture. It ends at the Grinch's table, Christmas dinner on Mank Crumpet. The Who's crowded into the cave. The Grinch at the head of the table, holding a carving knife, doing the one thing he's never done before in 40 years of watching from above. Hosting, welcoming, including. He carves the roast beast with the same intense focus he brings to everything else, because the Grinch at his best is someone who commits completely, who doesn't know how to do things halfway. And the image of it is both funny and genuinely warm. This is what the whole story was actually about. Not the theft, not the redemption, not even the heart growing 3 sizes. It was about a creature who wanted to belong to something, and a community that had to choose whether to let him, they let him, and he lets them let him. And that mutual choosing, fragile and imperfect and arrived at through an enormous amount of mutual destruction and accidental grace, is what the film closes on. Not a perfect Christmas, a real one. What Act 3 accomplishes. The resolution of the Grinch does something that its genre doesn't require but consistently rewards. It refuses to fully redeem everyone. The Grinch changes. Cindy Lou's faith is validated. Lou, who gets his Christmas morning back. But Mayor Mayhew is still Mayor Mayhew. The competitive consumerism of Whoville hasn't been dismantled, it's been interrupted. The community will go back to being itself with all the shallowness and status anxiety that entails, because communities don't fundamentally transform overnight. What changes is smaller and more durable. One relationship, one connection, one creature who came down from the mountain and, this time, was allowed to stay. The Grinch's story isn't about fixing Whoville. It isn't even entirely about fixing the Grinch. It's about what happens when 2 imperfect things, a damaged individual and a flawed community, stop using each other as excuses for their own failures and make room for something better. Not perfect, better. That's the kind of resolution that doesn't shout, it settles. It lands quietly in the chest and stays there, which is exactly where the best holiday films live. Act 3 has done its job. The story is complete. Now it's time to talk about the people who made it. The Grinch's story isn't about fixing Whoville. It's about what happens when 2 imperfect things, a damaged individual and a flawed community, stop using each other as excuses and make room for something better. Act 3 has done its job. Now it's time to talk about the people who made it. A script can only take a story so far. The screenplay for How the Grinch Stole Christmas, written by Jeffrey Price and Peter S. Seaman, lays out the plot, The scenes, the dialogue. It gives you the architecture. But what fills that architecture, what makes it breathe, comes entirely from the performers who inhabited these characters and the specific choices each one made in the moment the cameras were rolling. This is a film with an unusually rich performance ecosystem, not just at the top, where Jim Carrey is doing something genuinely exceptional, but all the way down the cast list. Every significant character in this story is doing real work. Each one carries a piece of the film's thematic argument. And each one deserves to be looked at closely, because the closer you look, the more interesting it gets. The Grinch, Jim Carrey, who he is before the story starts. The most important thing to understand about the Grinch as a character, and this is something the film earns through the childhood flashback structure, is that his defining trait isn't meanness, it's hurt. Those are not the same thing, and the distinction is everything. Mean is a character flaw. Mean is something that lives inside you and expresses itself outward. What the Grinch has is different. He was shaped by something external, something that happened to him at the age when children are most permeable, when the way other people respond to you becomes the foundation of how you understand yourself. He learned, in a classroom, in a moment of maximum vulnerability, that being himself was not acceptable. And he took that lesson, as children often do, completely literally. He didn't conclude that those particular children were cruel or that the situation was unfair. He concluded that he was wrong, that the problem was him. Everything that follows from that moment, the mountain, the isolation, the decades of curated resentment, is a man running a very sophisticated avoidance strategy. He can't be rejected if he doesn't show up. He can't be hurt if he converts every feeling into aggression before it can land. He can't miss belonging if he convinces himself he never wanted it. These aren't signs of genuine misanthropy. They're signs of someone protecting themselves with every tool available, including the tool of becoming the thing other people already decided he was. The Grinch became the monster they made him so he wouldn't have to keep being surprised when they treated him like one. The performance architecture. Jim Carrey's physical performance in this film operates on two simultaneous levels, and understanding both is key to understanding why it works as well as it does. The first level is pure comedy. The Grinch is a physical comedian's dream, a character with no social filter, no restraint, no obligation to maintain the performance of normality that constrains everyone else in Whoville. Carrey runs with that freedom at full speed. The Grinch lopes rather than walks, sits in ways that suggest he's never been taught what chairs are actually for, and conducts conversations with an unpredictability that keeps every scene slightly off balance. He improvised extensively, whole sequences, individual lines, physical bits that the script never specified. The daily planner monologue, the extended Christmas decorating sequence, the manic, self-interrupting internal debates. These didn't come from the page. They came from an actor who understood his character so deeply that he could generate new material that was entirely consistent with who the character was. The second level is something rarer and harder to execute. Physical comedy that carries emotional weight without breaking. Carrey never loses sight of the fact that the comedy is coming from a specific psychological place. The Grinch's physical excessiveness, the overreactions, the theatrical villainy, the performative self-loathing, is always rooted in someone who learned to use performance as protection. He's not being funny. He's being loud enough that nobody can hear what's actually going on underneath. Watch the scene where the Grinch receives Cindy Lou's invitation to the Whobilation. Carrey plays it as a series of emotional micro-reversals. Hope, suspicion, excitement, self-ridicule, cautious hope again, all cycling through in about 40 seconds. It's comedically precise, landing every beat at exactly the right moment. But it's also a genuine portrait of what ambivalence looks like in a creature that has been managing it alone for 40 years. Each reversal isn't a joke in isolation. It's a step in a process that the character has been through many times before, because the desire to go back and the fear of going back have been at war inside him for decades, and neither one has ever fully won. The physicality of damage. Carrey made specific choices about how the Grinch moves that reward close observation. The character's posture is habitually hunched, not in the way of someone merely tall, but in the way of someone who has spent years trying to take up less space. He folds inward when uncertain and expands outward when performing aggression, and the shift between those two modes is almost always the most honest moment in any given scene. When he contracts, he's being real. When he expands, he's being the character. His hands are particularly expressive. The prosthetic gloves limited some of the subtle finger movement that Carrey normally uses, so he compensated by making his entire arms more communicative, gestures larger, more deliberate, carrying meanings that would normally be conveyed by the face. In scenes where the prosthetics restrict his facial options, you can read his emotional state entirely through the angle and tension of his arms and shoulders. It's technically brilliant adaptation, an actor figuring out a new instrument mid-performance and playing it fluently. The most quietly devastating physical choice Carrey makes is stillness. The Grinch is, for most of the film, in near constant motion, jittery, reactive, physically excessive. So on the rare occasions when he goes completely still, your attention narrows to a laser point, the moment on Mount Anne, Crumpet when he hears Whoville singing on Christmas morning. Total stillness, total silence from him, everything suddenly internal. Lands with the impact it does specifically because it's so foreign to everything that came before it. Stillness, for this character, is the most extreme emotional state, and Carrey earns it by never using it cheaply. The arc, precisely. The Grinch's arc isn't from bad to good, it's from defended to open, from a creature maintaining a particular psychological posture to one who, through a combination of Cindy Lou's persistent kindness and his own suppressed longing, can no longer maintain it. The shift isn't a moral reformation, it's an emotional exhale after a 4-decade-held breath. What's crucial, and what separates this from a more conventional redemption arc, is that the film doesn't require the Grinch to apologize for everything he was. It doesn't ask him to be ashamed of the years on the mountain or even fully repudiate the theft. It asks him, more modestly and more honestly, to choose differently now. The past is what it was. The question is, what comes next? That's a more mature and ultimately more resonant version of redemption than the clean slate variety, because it acknowledges that actual healing rarely involves erasing what preceded it. By the final scene, the roast beast, the table, the Who's crowded into his cave, the Grinch hasn't become a different creature. He's become a more fully expressed version of himself, still strange, still excessive, still fundamentally unlike everyone else at the table, but no longer alone with all of it. That distinction is small and enormous simultaneously. Cindy Lou, Taylor Momsen, the underrated engine of the film. Ask most people who the main character of The Grinch is, and they'll say, the Grinch, which is correct in the obvious sense. He gets the most screen time, the most development, the most emotionally loaded scenes. But ask yourself whose decisions actually drive the plot forward, and the answer is unambiguously Cindy Lou Who. It is Cindy Lou who identifies the problem. It is Cindy Lou who formulates a response to it. It is Cindy Lou who nominates the Grinch, who pursues him, who goes to him after the Whobilation disaster when every other who has gone home, who asks him the question that eventually unlocks something. The Grinch doesn't choose to change. Change is done to him through persistent, unconditional engagement from a child who refused to accept the community's verdict on who he was allowed to be. She is, in the vocabulary of narrative function, the film's primary mover. The Grinch is the story subject. Cindy Lou is its engine. What Taylor Momsen? Taylor Momsen was 8 years old during filming, and the performance she delivers is one of those child acting achievements that you only fully appreciate as an adult rewatching something you loved as a kid. She doesn't do the thing that child actors in big productions often do, which is perform emotion, indicating sadness or joy or wonder at the prescribed moments, hitting marks, being technically present. What she does instead is something more naturalistic and ultimately more effective. She just is Cindy Lou. The quality that makes Cindy Lou work as a character is her seriousness. She's not a cute kid who says precocious things to get laughs. She's a child with a genuine moral preoccupation, and Momsen plays that preoccupation as weight rather than performance. When Cindy Lou is troubled by something, she's quiet about it, which is more convincing than theatrical distress and more affecting. When she speaks with a kind of directness that only exists before you've learned that directness makes adults uncomfortable. Her scenes with Carrey are remarkable in a specific way. She matches his energy without competing with it. That's not an easy thing for anyone, let alone a child actor opposite one of the most physically dominating performers in Hollywood. But Momsen holds her ground. She's the still center in his storm, and the contrast between them becomes, over the course of the film's central emotional image. The enormous, defended, chaotic creature and the small, open, undefended child, each finding in the other the thing they needed. Her function as moral compass. Cindy Lou carries the film's core thematic argument in her character alone. She represents the idea that the right response to a community's failure is not to accept it, but to address it, not with confrontation or accusation, but with the kind of stubborn, patient, utterly sincere conviction that refuses to be discouraged by setback. She fails first. The Whobilation is a disaster. Her plan to bring the Grinch back into community falls apart in the most public and embarrassing way possible. An adult, at that point, would reassess. An adult would conclude that the attempt was made and it didn't work, and the status quo is the status quo. Cindy Lou goes to find him anyway. She climbs the mountain, the same mountain that represents, in the film's visual language, everything dangerous and unwelcoming and other, and she asks him what he wants for Christmas. That question is the turning point of the entire film. Not the heart growing 3 sizes, not the singing on Christmas morning, not the sleigh at the cliff's edge. The turning point is a 6-year-old climbing a mountain to ask a creature what he wants, because nobody has ever asked him that before. Because the question treats him as someone whose desires are worth considering, and that treatment, unremarkable to Cindy Lou, radical to the Grinch, is the crack that eventually becomes the opening. Mayor Augustus Mayhew, Jeffrey Tambor, the real villain. In the original Seuss book, there's no Mayor Mayhew. There's no specific human villain. The Whos are collectively good, and the Grinch is collectively wrong, and that's the moral architecture. The 2000 film's decision to create Mayor Mayhew and make him the primary antagonist is arguably the most significant structural change the adaptation makes, and it changes the story's moral meaning entirely. Because with Mayhew in the picture, the Grinch's grievance becomes legitimate. He's not wrong about Whoville. He's wrong about what to do about it. And there's a specific person responsible for much of his damage, a specific person who is actively working to maintain the status quo that keeps the Grinch marginalized, a specific person whose motivations are self-interest dressed up as community leadership. Jeffrey Tambor plays Mayhew with a very specific kind of pomposity, not cartoonishly evil, not even particularly self-aware about his own villainy, but inhabited completely. Tambor finds the truth inside the character, which is a man who has mistaken his own preferences for community standards for so long that he can no longer tell the difference. When he opposes the Grinch's presence at the Whobilation, he genuinely believes he's protecting Whoville. It doesn't occur to him that what he's actually doing is protecting himself, protecting his position, his narrative, his decades-long claim to be the defining authority on what Whoville values and who it includes. His proposal to Martha May at the Whobilation, that specific, weaponized public gesture, reveals his character more completely than any amount of exposition could. He understands power. He knows exactly how to use public settings and social pressure to accomplish personal goals. And he does it without hesitation or guilt because in his own internal story, he's always the protagonist doing a reasonable thing. Tambor never overplays it. That restraint is what makes Mayhew genuinely unsettling rather than merely comedic. He's recognizable in a way that pure cartoon villains aren't. You've met versions of this man, haven't you? The person in a community who controls the narrative and calls it leadership, who defines belonging and calls it tradition, who manages other people's reputations while building their own. Mayhew is the system the Grinch was failed by, given a face and a ceremonial sash, his incomplete accountability. One of the film's most honest choices is that Mayhew never fully reckoned with what he did. He doesn't have a revelation. He doesn't apologize. He tries to reassert the old dynamic even on Christmas morning, and he's overridden not by his own conscience, but by Cindy Lou's moral clarity and the Who's collective decision to follow her rather than him. That's realistic. It's also thematically important. The film isn't arguing that communities are redeemed through their worst members having epiphanies. It's arguing that communities are redeemed through their best members refusing to accept the worst behavior as the community standard. Mayhew doesn't change. Whoville changes around him, not because he led them there, but because Cindy Lou did. Max, the dog, scene, stealing perfection. No character analysis of this film is complete without a proper appreciation of Max. The dog is, technically, a supporting character. He has no lines, minimal agency, and spends most of his screen time being press-ganged into participating in plans he clearly has reservations about. And yet he is, scene for scene, one of the most reliably funny and quietly affecting presences in the film. The comedy of Max operates entirely through reaction. He's the straight man in a film that's otherwise committed to maximum chaos. The one character whose facial expressions are always communicating something like, "I want you to know that I am aware of how insane this is." When the Grinch ropes him into the sleigh with makeshift reindeer antlers, Max's expression doesn't just sell the gag, it contextualizes the whole enterprise. This creature has been doing variations of this for decades, the look says. He is fully committed, without reservation or complaint, to helping this green lunatic achieve his goals. Not because he agrees with those goals, because he loves him. That's the thing about Max that the film deploys very gently. He's not just comic relief. He's the only unconditional relationship in the Grinch's life. The only living creature that has been present through all of it, the resentment, the schemes, the years of isolation, and has never once indicated that any of it changes his fundamental position on the Grinch, which is one of complete and uncomplicated devotion. He knows how to accept it from Max, because Max never made it conditional. And that small background detail, a dog that has always been loyal to a creature the world told him was unlovable, quietly underpins the film's central argument about what genuine connection looks like. Martha May Whoville, Christine Baranski. The complication. She represents Martha May exists in the film as a walking what if. She's the one who didn't laugh in that classroom. She was the one connection the young Grinch allowed himself and the person whose presence at the jubilation makes the mayor's gambit so devastatingly effective. Christine Baranski brings her a kind of carefully maintained poise, someone who has processed a complicated emotional history and arrived at a functional equilibrium that's doing its best not to get disturbed. The unspoken story of Martha May is in some ways sadder than the Grinch's own story. She didn't run. She stayed in Whoville, and she watched the Grinch become a myth and a warning and a community ghost story, and she's been living alongside that for decades without ever being able to address it. When she speaks to the Grinch at the jubilation, briefly, carefully, with the precise tenderness of someone who knows they're standing near something volatile, you feel the weight of everything she can't say in a public setting with the mayor watching. Her final moment in the film, rejecting Mayhew's ring, the signal that the community is beginning to recalibrate its values, is quiet and decisive and exactly the right note for the character. She doesn't make a speech about it. She simply stops participating in the system that was always arranged around the convenience of the wrong person. Lou, who? Bill Irwin, the heart the film doesn't shout about Lou, who is the easiest character to undervalue in The Grinch, and Bill Irwin plays him with the specific kind of understatement that makes him the film's most quietly resonant adult human presence. He's not particularly funny, he doesn't have a spectacular arc. He's a father who works too hard during the holidays and loves his family genuinely and has participated, without much reflection, in a community culture that rewards the wrong things. His defining characteristic is simple goodness, not the performed goodness of Whoville's Christmas spectacle, but the actual variety. He's kind because he's kind, not because anyone is watching. What his character does for the film is provide Cindy Lou's moral inheritance. She didn't develop her instinct for fairness from nowhere. She got it from watching her father be a decent person in a town that doesn't particularly reward decency. His quiet presence is the answer to the question the film keeps circling. Is there anything real underneath the Whoville performance? Lou, who is the yes. The Who's as an symbol collective character. The Who's function, collectively, as something unusual in a family film, an ensemble antagonist with genuine complexity. They're not the bad guys, but they're complicit. They're not cruel. But they've been comfortable with cruelty as long as it was directed at someone they'd already collectively decided not to think too hard about. They're a community that functions exactly the way real communities function. Mostly well-intentioned, largely inattentive, capable of both profound generosity and profound selfishness, and deeply resistant to revising the stories they tell about themselves. It holds them accountable without villainizing them, which is a much harder tonal needle to thread, and is one of the reasons the story's resolution feels genuinely earned. The Who's are transformed into better people by Christmas morning. They make a choice, to sing when there's nothing left to sing about, to follow Cindy Lou rather than Mayhew, to set a place at the table for the creature they failed decades ago. And the film trusts that choice to be enough, not perfect, enough. The performance ecosystem. What makes The Grinch work as a character study, and it genuinely does work as one, which is not a sentence you'd expect to write about a 2000 Christmas comedy, is that every character in it is doing something specific and purposeful. They're not decoration. They're not types. Carrie's Grinch is a psychological portrait built from the inside out. Momsen's Cindy Lou is the film's moral intelligence, played with instinctive precision. Tambor's Mayhew is the recognizable face of institutional cruelty. Irwin's Lou, who is quiet evidence that goodness exists in Whoville even when the community's loudest voices don't represent it. Baranski's Martha May is the road not taken, keeping the Grinch's humanity alive in someone else's memory even when he can't maintain it in himself. And Max is the proof of concept, that this creature is worth loving, that he always was. They form an ensemble that argues its film's themes without ever seeming to argue anything. They just live in their story, and the meaning accumulates around them naturally, the way meaning accumulates around real people in real situations. That's hard to do. They did it. They form an ensemble that argues its film's themes without ever seeming to argue anything. They just live in their story, and the meaning accumulates around them naturally, the way meaning accumulates around real people in real situations. That's hard to do. They did it. That version doesn't become a holiday classic. That version doesn't get watched 25 Decembers in a row. That version doesn't produce a performance that people still talk about as one of the most committed physical achievements in mainstream cinema. The reason we have the film we actually have, textured, physical, alive in ways that digital work of that era couldn't replicate, comes entirely down to a series of craft decisions made by a small group of extraordinarily talented people who collectively chose the harder path when the easier one was available. Let's go department by department. Rick Baker in the makeup that changed the rules. The problem nobody had solved before. Rick Baker is, by any reasonable measure, the greatest prosthetic makeup artist in Hollywood history. 7 Academy Awards. Decades of work that includes An American Werewolf in London, Ed Wood, Men in Black, The Nutty Professor. He had spent an entire career at the frontier of what latex and foam and human ingenuity could accomplish on a human face. And when he took on the Grinch, he encountered a problem that was genuinely new. The problem wasn't making Jim Carrey look like the Grinch. Baker could do that in his sleep. The problem was making Jim Carrey look like the Grinch while Jim Carrey was doing what Jim Carrey does, which is perform with every muscle of his face at once, at full velocity, with the kind of micro-expressiveness that most actors don't have and that makes the difference, in Carrey's case, between a good performance and a great one. Standard prosthetic appliances of the era had a fundamental limitation. They moved when you moved them, but they moved after you moved, with a lag that read on camera as a deadening of expression. The prosthetic sits on the face like a second skin, and second skins have their own physics. For most actors, working in more measured, less physically extreme registers, this wasn't a serious problem. For Carrey, doing what Carrey does at the intensity Carrey does it, standard prosthetics would have turned his face into a mask. The performance would have been buried. Baker's solution. Baker and his team developed new formulations of foam latex specifically for this production. Lighter, more reactive, engineered to respond faster to the muscular movements underneath them. They spent months in pre-production testing different compounds, different application techniques, different structural approaches to the appliances themselves. The goal was to build a prosthetic face that had essentially no perceptible lag, that moved with Carrey's muscles rather than slightly behind them. They achieved it. Watch any close-up of the Grinch in full expression and pay attention to the speed of the transition. The way the sneer becomes the wide-eyed shock becomes the conspiratorial grin, each shift landing at exactly the moment Carrey's underlying muscles produce it. That responsiveness didn't happen by accident. It was engineered, tested, refined over months of developmental work that never appears on screen because its whole purpose was to be invisible. The full makeup application required 4 to 5 prosthetic pieces per day: forehead, nose, cheeks, chin, and the hand appliances, each requiring precise placement and seamless blending. The green coloration was not paint applied over completed prosthetics. It was built into the appliances themselves through a tinting process, then refined with additional coloring work on set. The yak hair? Yes, actual yak hair was applied in layers using techniques borrowed from theatrical wig work, each strand positioned to read correctly at camera distance without appearing artificial in close-up. The total application ran between 2 and 2.5 hours every single morning. Removal at the end of shooting days took another hour, for 92 shooting days. That's nearly 300 hours of Jim Carrey sitting in that chair, which is a number that sounds impossible until you remember that the result on screen makes it look like the Grinch simply exists rather than being constructed fresh every day. The contact lenses, one element that gets less attention than it deserves. The contact lenses. The Grinch's yellow, slitted eyes are achieved through custom contact lenses, and custom contact lenses of that complexity are profoundly uncomfortable. They restrict vision in ways that affect peripheral awareness, which matters enormously for a performer whose entire technique depends on spatial awareness and physical improvisation. Carrey was navigating complex physical choreography, often in tight spaces or around other cast members, with his vision significantly compromised. He adapted by rehearsing extensively with the contacts before principal photography began, essentially training himself to work within the new visual parameters, the way a musician adapts to an instrument with an unfamiliar action. By the time cameras were rolling, the limitation had become, through sheer rehearsal discipline, a manageable part of the Grinch's physical grammar. The slightly unfocused quality the lenses gave his gaze, that sense that the Grinch is always seeing something slightly sideways from everyone else, became, accidentally and usefully, part of the character's look. Mickle Kornblith and the world that shall next, building Seuss from scratch. Production designer Michael Kornblith faced a design challenge that had no real precedent: create a three-dimensional, physically inhabitable version of a visual world that exists entirely in 2 dimensions, in illustrations that follow the logic of a particular artistic imagination rather than the logic of physical reality. Seuss's Whoville has curves where architecture has straight lines, proportions where perspective rules have no authority, and a relationship to gravity that is at best advisory. Every building seems to have been designed by someone who understood what buildings are for, but had never been constrained by how they're built. The challenge isn't just replicating that visually, it's replicating it at a scale that allows a camera to move through it, at a resolution that holds up in extreme close-up, and with a physical weight that makes it feel inhabited rather than constructed. Cornblith's approach was to treat Whoville as a real place that had simply evolved under different physical laws. Every curve in every building had a structural logic, eccentric logic, Seussian logic, but logic nonetheless. Buildings weren't just bent arbitrarily, they bent in ways that suggested the natural processes of a world that grew its architecture, the way trees grow, following the path of least resistance toward light and space, accumulating detail over time, shaped by the specific needs and personalities of the hoes who lived inside them. The scale of the construction. The Whoville exterior set occupied a full soundstage at Universal Studios, one of the largest interior sets constructed for any film at that point in Hollywood history. Buildings were constructed at multiple scales, a technique borrowed from classic studio-era filmmaking, full-scale sections for scenes involving direct physical interaction, slightly reduced scale sections for background architecture that would be seen at a distance, and forced perspective sections designed to create the illusion of depth beyond what the stage could physically contain. The detailing at each scale was meticulously consistent. Close-up texture, the painted surfaces of doorways and windowsills, the grain of the materials, the accumulated weathering that suggests a lived-in history, were carried through to background elements at reduced visibility. The result is a set that has visual coherence at every depth of field. Whether the camera is 6 inches from a door or 200 feet from the whole town, Whoville reads as a single, internally consistent place. The color palette was controlled at the production design level rather than in post-production, meaning the specific hues of every surface were selected and approved before a single frame was shot, and the entire visual ecosystem of the film was calibrated from those decisions. The slightly oversaturated, slightly too vivid quality of Whoville that feels intentional and meaningful is not a filter applied in editing. It's baked into the physical world the Cornblith's team built. The Grinch's cave is counter-design. What makes the cave on Ma Crumpet so effective as a visual space is that it was designed in explicit opposition to Whoville's aesthetic. Where Whoville is curved and soft and uniformly colored, the cave is angular and harsh and chromatic chaos. Every surface a different texture, every object mismatched with every adjacent object. It's a space that communicates a personality, brilliant but disordered, eclectic but isolated, capable of function but organized by private logic rather than social convention. The accumulated artifacts of the cave, decades of stolen and discarded Whoville material, repurposed and stacked and arranged in patterns that make sense to one creature and nobody else, were curated by the production design team to tell the Grinch's history without dialogue. Each object is a data point. What he took, when he took it, what he did with it. The cave reads as an autobiography in 3 dimensions. James Horner and the score that feels like memory. Playing both sides, James Horner, composer of Titanic, Braveheart, Field of Dreams, understood something crucial about this film's tonal requirement. The score needs to live in the same emotional space the story does, which means it needs to hold comedy and genuine feeling simultaneously without resolving either into the other. He accomplished this through a distinctive orchestral approach that uses familiar Christmas musical vocabulary as a foundation and then subtly distorts it, pushing it slightly too fast for comfort, or slightly too minor key, or layered with an ironic woodwind line that comments on what the strings are doing. The music of Whoville's Christmas is recognizable as Christmas music, but it's Christmas music that's working just a little too hard. It has the quality of performance rather than feeling, which is exactly right for a community whose relationship to the holiday is precisely that. The Grinch's thematic material, by contrast, has a minor key warmth to it that's easy to miss because it lives underneath the comic villain surface material. His theme isn't purely sinister. It has a wry, self-aware quality, a kind of melody that knows it's playing the bad guy and finds the whole situation slightly absurd. But beneath that, in the cello and low-string figures that accompany his quieter moments, there's something genuinely melancholic. Horner is scoring the wound as much as the performance, and the emotional undertow of the film relies heavily on those moments where the music tells you something the character isn't saying. The Cindy Lou theme. Cindy Lou's musical identity is the score's most understated achievement. Her theme is simple, almost childishly simple, a few notes in a high register that feel like a question rather than a statement. It recurs throughout the film in moments when the story needs to locate its moral center, and it works precisely because of its simplicity. In a score full of complex orchestral work and sophisticated musical irony, the Cindy Lou theme sounds like someone telling the truth. When her theme appears during the Christmas morning singing sequence, woven into the full orchestral arrangement of Whoville singing together, it's the score's way of identifying who made this moment possible. The music knows what the story knows. This is her victory, not the Grinch's. He changed because she refused to stop believing he could. Where Are You Christmas? And Faith Hill, separate from Horner's score, the film's original song, Where Are You Christmas?, written by Mariah Carey, James Horner, and Will Jennings, performed by Faith Hill, deserves its own acknowledgement as a craft achievement. The song works because it doesn't belong to the film's comedy register at all. It operates entirely in the emotional register, a genuine, unironic inquiry about the spirit of something that the film has been dissecting critically for most of its runtime. Placed at the moment when Cindy Lou is beginning to feel the weight of what she's taken on, it functions as the film's most direct statement of what all this is actually about: the fear that the thing you love might be less real than you believed, and the determination to keep looking for it anyway. Hill's performance is restrained and unaffected in a way that suits both the character's age and the song's function in the narrative. It doesn't oversell the emotion, it finds it and stays with it. Ron Howard's direction, the invisible architecture. Managing the tonal tightrope. Ron Howard's directorial challenge on this film was genuinely unusual. He needed to simultaneously be a comedy director, a production spectacle director, and an intimate dramatic director, sometimes within the same scene, sometimes within the same shot. His solution was to anchor the camera behavior to the emotional register of the moment. In Whoville spectacle sequences, the jubilation arrival, the decorating montage, the Christmas morning return, Howard deploys wide lenses and sweeping camera movement, using the full scale of the production design to create visual grandeur. These sequences feel expansive and slightly overwhelming, which is appropriate for a town that is itself expansive and slightly overwhelming. In intimate scenes, the Grinch and Cindy Lou in the cave, the childhood flashbacks, the sleigh at the cliff's edge, the camera behavior changes completely. Tighter lenses, less movement, longer takes that give performers room to operate. The camera follows rather than leads, prioritizing face and body over environment. Howard trusts his actors in these moments rather than directing around them, which is why the emotional beats land when they do. They've been given space to breathe rather than space to be photographed. The flashback. Visual language. The childhood flashback sequences have a distinct visual treatment that separates them from the rest of the film. Slightly warmer color grading, softer lens quality, reduced contrast. It's a subtle difference, not the heavy visual treatment of many films' flashback sequences, but it communicates something specific. The past doesn't look better than the present exactly. It looks softer, less defined. The way memory actually looks, not a perfect record but an impression, something that's been carried for a long time and worn smooth at the edges. This visual approach to the flashbacks matters because it keeps them emotionally honest. They're not idealized. Young Grinch's world wasn't perfect before the classroom incident. It was already complicated, already tinged with the awareness that he was different, and that different had consequences. The softness of the visual treatment acknowledges that what we're watching has been processed through decades of memory, and memory has its own distortions. Letting comedy and feeling coexist. The most underappreciated aspect of Howard's direction is something that's only visible in its absence: the absolute refusal to punctuate emotional moments with comedy, and the equally absolute refusal to punctuate comic moments with sentiment. In films that attempt this tonal range, directors often reach for one register to diffuse the discomfort of the other. A tender scene gets a joke at the end to let the audience off the hook. A comic scene gets an emotional button to remind them this matters. Howard doesn't do either. He lets the comedy be funny on its own terms and lets the feeling be felt on its own terms, and he trusts the audience to hold both without needing one to validate the other. That directorial restraint, knowing when not to underline, is why the film's most emotional moments hit as hard as they do. They haven't been diluted by irony, and the comedy hasn't been cheapened by being made to serve a lesson. The craft of How the Grinch Stole Christmas is, in the end, the craft of invisible ambition, of enormous technical and creative effort deployed in service of a story that should feel effortless. You don't watch this film and think about foam latex formulations or forced perspective or orchestral layering. You watch it and feel something. The technical achievement is that you can't see the seams, and making that true. For a film this large, this ambitious, this physically extreme in its demands required some of the finest craft work of its era. You don't watch this film and think about foam latex formulations or forced perspective or orchestral layering. You watch it and feel something. The technical achievement is that you can't see the seams, and making that true required some of the finest craft work of its era. Strip away the makeup, the sets, the score, the spectacle, strip all of it away. And what you're left with is a story about a community that manufactured an outcast and then called him dangerous. Everything else in this film, every technical achievement and every performance choice is in service of that central idea. And that idea is not small. The Grinch has things to say, real things, Uncomfortable things sometimes, dressed up in Christmas colors and delivered with enough comedy that you can absorb them without fully realizing you're being asked a serious question. That's not an accident. That's the work. The consumerism problem, and why it's more than a subplot. The film's critique of consumerism isn't subtle, but it's also not simple, which is what elevates it above the typical holiday movie's obligatory Christmas is about more than presents. Speech. Whoville's problem isn't that the Whos like stuff. People like stuff. That's human, or who, man, if you want to be precise about the species. The problem is what the stuff has been made to represent: status, belonging, worthiness. The competitive gift buying, the decorating rivalries, the social hierarchy organized around who participates most visibly in the holiday machine. These aren't incidental details of Whoville's culture. They're the operating system. And when your operating system runs on visible participation as proof of belonging, you've built a community that can only include people who can perform the right way. The Grinch can't perform the right way. He never could. His difference, physical, temperamental, fundamental, made him legible to Whoville as wrong before he'd done anything wrong. And so the community's consumerist performance culture, which requires a certain kind of conformity as the price of inclusion, was always going to exclude him, not through individual malice, but through structural logic. The machine wasn't designed for creatures like him, and the machine doesn't apologize for that. What the film argues, and this is where it gets genuinely interesting, is that the machine isn't good for the Whos either. Lou, who is exhausted. Cindy Lou is troubled. The holiday that's supposed to bring the community together is producing competitive anxiety and social pressure and a relentless performance of enthusiasm that bears less and less resemblance to actual joy. Whoville isn't thriving under its own system. It's just used to it. The Grinch sees this with extraordinary clarity. His critique of Whoville's Christmas is not wrong. They're going to feast, 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 feast. They'll eat their Who pudding and rare Who roast beast. He knows what's under the tinsel. The tragedy isn't his misperception, it's his conclusion. He sees the emptiness accurately and concludes from that there's nothing real underneath. He's wrong about that part, but he's not wrong about the emptiness. Here's the question the film keeps circling without ever quite asking out loud: who made the Grinch? Not in the biological sense. He was found on a doorstep, raised by two aunts, brought into Whoville as an infant. In the psychological sense, in the sense that matters for understanding why a creature who was, by all available evidence, capable of warmth and connection and genuine feeling, ended up alone on a mountain for 40 years, converting every impulse toward other people into something sharp and defensive. The classroom scene is the film's most honest moment because it refuses to distribute the blame neatly. It wasn't one bully. It wasn't organized cruelty. It was a group of children responding to something strange in the way that children often respond to strangeness, with laughter, with distance, with the instinctive social calculation of young people working out the hierarchy of acceptable and unacceptable. Nobody in that classroom made a decision to destroy the Grinch. They just responded to him in aggregate, and the aggregate response was enough. That's a more troubling diagnosis than a single villain. It's the diagnosis of a system. The Whos didn't need to coordinate their cruelty because their culture had already done that work, had already defined what belonged and what didn't, and the Grinch had already been filed in the wrong category before he opened his mouth. Individual children acted out the values of the culture they'd been raised in, and the result was a wound that lasted 40 years. The film takes this seriously enough to hold Whoville accountable without condemning it entirely. The Whos can do better. They eventually do, but the film doesn't let them off the hook for how they got there, which is the morally honest position. Redemption doesn't erase causation. The deepest thematic layer of The Grinch is also its most personal, and it's the reason the film resonates differently with adults than with children. What Cindy Lou understands, instinctively, without theoretical framework, is the difference between belonging and performing belonging. Whoville performs belonging constantly. The Whobilation, the decorating, the gift exchange, these are the rituals that signal membership in the community, and membership is what you're actually after. The rituals are means to an end. But somewhere along the way, Whoville confused the means for the end, and now the performance is the community, and anyone who can't or won't perform at the required level is legible as outside. The Grinch, who cannot perform belonging in the Whoville idiom, concludes from this that he doesn't belong. That's the core of his damage, the equation of performance with reality, the conclusion that if the community's rituals exclude him, the community itself excludes him, and therefore there is no community for him anywhere. Cindy Lou breaks this equation by simply refusing to perform it. She doesn't offer the Grinch inclusion contingent on his participation in the Whobilation. She offers him something prior to and more fundamental than that, the acknowledgement that his desire to belong is legitimate regardless of his ability to demonstrate it in the right way. She treats him, in other words, as someone whose worth doesn't depend on his performance. And that treatment, small, quiet, unremarkable to her, is the most radical thing anyone in Whoville has ever done for him. The film's argument, then, isn't that Christmas is really about love, not presents. That's the Hallmark version. The film's argument is more specific and more uncomfortable, that communities built around performance metrics for belonging will always produce the people they exclude, and that those people aren't the problem. The metric is. The physical literalism of Seuss's original conceit, the heart growing 3 sizes, gets a more psychologically specific meaning in the 2000 film. It's not that the Grinch becomes a bigger person, or a better person, or even a fundamentally different person. What grows is capacity. Capacity for feeling, which he'd been restricting for 40 years as a protective measure. The Grinch always had the capability for warmth. We know this because we saw the child version of him exercise it freely. What the adult Grinch has done is impose a spending limit on that capability, allow only so much in, only so much out, maintain enough distance that nothing can get close enough to hurt again. When the heart grows 3 sizes, the spending limit lifts, not because the Grinch has decided to trust Whoville, he hasn't, not fully, and probably never will completely, but because the evidence has become too strong to maintain the old structure again. Whoville sang when there was nothing to sing about, and the Grinch, standing at the top of his mountain with all their Christmas and all his defenses, simply cannot make his old theory of the world accommodate that fact. Growth, in this film, is not moral transformation. It's the surrender of a lie you've been telling yourself in order to function. The Grinch didn't become good, he became honest. What the Grinch leaves you with, if you let it, is a question that extends well beyond Whoville and well beyond Christmas. What are the things you've organized your belonging around? What's the performance you're required to give in order to stay inside the community you're inside? And who is standing outside in the cold because the performance you've all agreed to do has a price of admission they can't meet? The Grinch is a specific creature with a specific wound in a specific made-up world. He's also a shape that real people fit. That's why this story has existed in some form since 1957 and shows no sign of losing its relevance, because every community produces its Grinches, not intentionally, not maliciously, but through the accumulated weight of the standards it sets and the exclusions those standards require. The question isn't whether you have a Grinch in your Whoville, you do. The question is whether you have a Cindy Lou. How the Grinch Stole Christmas hit theaters in November 2000, and the numbers were staggering. $55 million in its opening weekend. $260 million domestically by the end of its run, over $345 million worldwide, against a production budget of $123 million. It was the highest-grossing film in the United States that year. Not the highest-grossing Christmas film, the highest-grossing film, period, in a year that included Gladiator and Castaway and Mission Impossible 2. The critical response was divided, which in retrospect reads as a more interesting response than simple praise would have been. Critics who loved it pointed to Carrey's performance and the film's surprising thematic ambition. Critics who resisted it argued that the film's excess overwhelmed its emotional core. Too much Jim Carrey, too much production, too much of everything. Both reactions identified real things. The film is excessive. It is also, underneath the excess, genuinely moving. And the argument between those two assessments has never fully resolved, which is often the sign of a film doing something real rather than something safe. Rick Baker won the Academy Award for Best Makeup at the 73rd Academy Awards. It was deserved and also inevitable. No film that year came close to what his team accomplished, technically or artistically. The win acknowledged not just the visual achievement but the entire philosophy behind it. That practical craft, done at the highest level, produces something that digital work cannot replicate. 25 years later, the film's cultural footprint is specific and durable. It established Jim Carrey's Grinch as the definitive live-action interpretation of the character so completely that the 2018 animated Universal film, despite its massive marketing and Benedict Cumberbatch's vocal performance, has never displaced the 2000 version in the cultural imagination. Carrey's Grinch is what people mean when they say, "The Grinch." That's a remarkable achievement for a performance built on prosthetics and physical comedy. It stuck. The film also quietly shifted the template for holiday blockbusters. Before The Grinch, the idea of a live-action adaptation of a beloved illustrated children's book as a major studio holiday release was not an established genre. After it, it became a reliable formula. Cat in the Hat, Polar Express, and eventually a whole wave of nostalgia. IP adaptations owe something to the commercial proof of concept that The Grinch provided in 2000, that the formula has been executed with varying degrees of success, and often far less ambition, doesn't diminish the original's role in establishing it. Ron Howard's direction demonstrated something the industry frequently forgets, The family films can carry genuine thematic weight without condescending to their audience or sacrificing their entertainment value. The film doesn't talk down to children about consumerism or belonging. It shows them a story that embeds those ideas in character and situation, trusting that the ideas will land the way stories always land, through feeling rather than instruction. The reason How the Grinch Stole Christmas survives 25 holiday seasons isn't nostalgia. Although nostalgia is certainly present, nostalgia explains why people rewatch things. It doesn't explain why those rewatches still hold up. What holds up is the specificity. The film is not a general argument about Christmas spirit. It's a specific story about a specific creature with a specific damage, in a specific community with specific flaws, moving toward a specific kind of resolution that is partial and honest rather than complete and false. The specificity is what ages well. Generalities date, specific truths don't. There's also the matter of what different ages bring to the screen. Children watching The Grinch in 2000 saw a funny green monster who hated Christmas and eventually changed his mind. Those same people watching it at 25 see The Grinch's 40 years of defended isolation and recognize something in it. At 35, they might see The Who's frantic holiday performance and recognize something else. The film grows with you because it was built with enough depth that there's always something new to find depending on where you're standing. Here's what stays with me, rewatching this film every few years. It's not the sleigh at the cliff's edge, though that's a great sequence. It's not the makeup, though. That's a technical miracle. It's not even Carrey's performance at its most pyrotechnic, though that's some of the finest physical comedy the era produced. It's the Grinch, standing at the top of his mountain in the early morning dark, hearing something he built his entire life to not believe in. A community singing when they have nothing left to sing about. And the look on his face, still helpless. 40 years of architecture starting to give, when the evidence finally outweighs the defense. That moment works because this film did the work to earn it. Because you spent 90 minutes understanding exactly how much that mountain cost him and exactly what it means for the music to reach him anyway. The green yak hair and the foam latex and the hand-built Whoville and the swoosh and curves and all the rest of it, all of that exists so that one creature, standing on one mountain, hearing one sound, can break through your chest and land somewhere that stays. Some movies make you feel something once and forget it. Some make you feel it every December for the rest of your life. You already know which kind this is.